Welcome to part 2 of the Chapter 36, Nationalism and Political Identities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America overview. In this section of the overview, we're going to look at China. And just as a warning before we start, China's history at this time is incredibly complicated and it can be quite confusing. This complicated history comes from the fact that China was fighting a civil war within its borders between a group called the Kuomintang and then the communists, but it also had to deal with outside pressures from Japan, and this included World War II. So keep that in mind as we move through the Asian paths to autonomy in China. To understand this, you need to go all the way back to the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911. And this was because of a lot of different reasons. China was far behind the Western powers. They had been carved up by Western powers, and they were having a really rough time just dealing with outside pressures in general. This allowed a Western-educated thinker named Sun Yat-sen to declare a republic. And this republic was not very successful. But Sun Yat-sen had this idea that the Chinese Republic had to move in 3 stages. First, he had to develop nationalism within China because people were not really loyal to the country of China, especially because the Qing had been foreigners. Then, after that, you could form a republic. And thirdly, you needed to industrialize. Now, unfortunately, this did not really work out very well because China became very politically fragmented and divided up into warlords. The leader of China was named Yuan. He was basically a warlord. And these, what were called the 3 principles, were really pushed into the background. Frustrations caused by the European and American recognition of Japanese control in the Paris Peace Conference led to the May 4th movement and a turbulent period of self-examination. The May 4th movement was where students, outraged at what was supposed to be a gift of China was supposed to get territory back in the Treaty of Versailles. However, they did not because of a backroom deal with the Western powers and the Japanese. And there was a bunch of land given to Japan, which, given the history of China and Japan, was incredibly insulting. So many students who were outraged by this started a movement, a protest movement, and China didn't even sign this peace treaty. So this just furthered the outrage between China and the West. A group called the Kuomintang, which was led by Sun Yat-sen, and then Chiang Kai-shek. You might remember this guy from American history, and his name would have been spelled Chiang Kai-shek. In American political cartoons, he's often depicted with the saying, "Cash my check," because he was very supportive of industry and businesses, even foreign businesses within China. And he was not very much a friend to the peasants. He forcibly moved peasants into factories. He was more a supporter of big business. Because of this, a rivalry developed with the Chinese Communist Party. And out of all the different leaders of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong rose to the forefront. Mao Zedong was known as a friend of the peasants. His dad was a landlord, and so he saw exploitation firsthand before he went to school. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek were both influenced by Sun Yat-sen, but their influence led to different outcomes. Mao became a communist, where Chiang Kai-shek focused more on industrialization. They had very different interpretations. Okay, so the Kuomintang and the communists fought against each other until they had to work to get rid of Japan. In 1931/32, they worked together to try to get rid of the Japanese control. So external threats, particularly that of the Japanese, complicated the situation between these two. The Kuomintang and Chinese communists, the very definition of strange bedfellows, worked together to reduce Japanese influence when they weren't actively trying to eliminate one another. They both wanted Japan's influence to end. They were, however, not entirely successful with this. Now, in 1934, Chiang Kai-shek almost captured Mao Zedong in this kind of seesawing back and forth between being partners and fighting against each other. This was one of the times they were fighting against each other. Chiang Kai-shek almost captured Mao in 1934, but the Mao Zedong went on the Long March, which only succeeded in solidifying Mao's reputation. And I'll tell you a little bit about why this is. But before I do that, you need to know that the Long March is a strategic retreat. A strategic retreat. It was 370 days, 6,000 miles, and it started out with 80,000 men, of which only 10,000 remained at the end of the journey. Also, 35,000 women joined the march. So the Maoists knew that they could not fight Chiang Kai-shek and his industrial war machine head on because they didn't have enough manpower or weaponry. So Mao Zedong became sort of a Robin Hood, and he would go in his strategic retreat northwest, from town to town to town, always being very polite to the people whom he stayed with. In this way, he befriended the peasants. He paid for things. His soldiers were also always very nice to the people in these villages. He developed a good reputation, whereas Chiang Kai-shek killed and pillaged these villages and purged communists from them. Now, this made Chiang Kai-shek look really bad, and it made him look like he was more aligned with foreign powers. In the end, Mao made peasants the cornerstone of his revolution, which was veering away from Marxism because it was less industrial. Right? There is no working class proletariat at this time in China, at least not in a large number. Mao came out from this Long March as the leader of China, whereas Chiang Kai-shek was forced in a kidnapping in 1937, after a couple more years of civil war, to leave China. He left with all of the gold from China's government, like all of their currency, gold storage, like basically all of the wealth of China, and he moved to Taiwan. Now, this is why, after World War I, Mao created the Communist People's Republic of China, which is actually the correct name of China, and Chiang Kai-shek was in Taiwan, which was China, right? We renamed it China, or it was Taiwan, that's what he was saying was China. For a long time in diplomatic circles, Taiwan actually represented China, which is just insane. So here's Chiang Kai-shek, here's Mao Zedong. This picture shows us the Long March. And you can see the purple were places that were controlled by the communists, and then the green were areas of effective control. You can see the areas controlled by the Japan. Japan called this puppet state Manchukuo, which we'll get more into in chapter 37. But here is the Long March. So the Long March became a huge part of communist propaganda. Here you can see the people of the Long March going through the cold, snowy mountains. They all look like they are, raising their hands backwards in pride. This guy is smiling, which probably was not an expression often seen on the Long March. Here's Mao and people from the Long March, and then these are the youth kind of in the symbol of the Long March, and this is Mao's little red book, which was his philosophy of communism and youth culture. In the next portion of this PowerPoint, we will talk about Africa. And as a final note, remember that during this time, Japan was becoming hyper-nationalist.